Alright, so I always wanted to recreate an anime fighting scene. Even just a couple of shots in a game engine would be great. And it shouldn't be that hard, right? Well... So let's do something crazy. Remember Naruto? Yeah, you do, right? Well, I don't. I never watched much of it, but as a VFX artist I admire it and I always have to look up for reference everywhere. Everywhere. And anime has a lot of good reference. So here I was on a Sunday ready to begin this remake of the Naruto vs Sasuke fighting scene. More specifically, this moment right here.
You already know that, don't you, Sasuke?
Seems pretty simple, right? Oof, well, it wasn't. So I began with this blockout, kind of a storyboard of each shot that I was gonna recreate. This allowed me to better understand what elements I needed. Which essentially, in terms of visual effects, is pretty much 4 distinct effects, 4 distinct abilities that, yes, please help me remember the names, because I've forgotten. But essentially Naruto has 2 orbs that he is charging up, while Sasuke has this arrow made of electricity that shoots in the direction of the 2 orbs, and when they collide it creates this mega explosion. That's what I aim to recreate in Unity with the help of the timeline and with the particle system, and shaders, shader graph, yeah. So I began to focus my attention on this yellow orb that Naruto is charging up. There's a lot of wind going on, and there's this very fast spinning kind of spiral texture, and inside it we have this bright yellow content. So I fired up Material Maker, which is a free software that kind of allows VFX artists to create procedural textures. As you can see, this is the chain of nodes that I've created just to output this texture right here, which I was very happy at the moment with it. But once I went to Unity, I wasn't so happy about it anymore. Because you see, this swirl is kind of very much blurred. So I created another version of this texture, this one, and then another version.
A few moments later.
Until I got to something more or less like this. The idea is to give it a spinning motion, and I arrived at this point and I was like, yeah, okay, that's not that bad. Let's move on to the next part. Now I really wanted to test some wind effects, so I created this sphere, and the idea was to map a texture more or less around this vertex and then scroll it with a shader. Because shaders allow you to control textures and many things in many ways. Then if I decrease the intensity of the white, it would look pretty much like wind. Now that was only one sphere. What happens if we add a bunch of them with different rotation and the texture is scrolling in all of them? Well, we kind of create this pretty cool effect. Now, I really felt like I was missing some whoosh, something like the wind was coming from the outside to the inside of the sphere. So I created this path right here, which is essentially a Bezier curve, but then you can turn this into a 3D object by extruding. And I was like, yeah, this probably would work. The idea was also to once again scroll a texture thanks to a shader, and it would give the sensation that there was wind coming from the outside. So I also added a bunch of them with different rotation and different lifetime, and this is what I got. It was looking very interesting. And then just to test out the center, the yellow center, I had this yellow blob that, yeah, definitely didn't fit at all. Well, I was getting really tired of this orb, so I moved on to the next one, which was the purple one. And essentially I duplicated the yellow one, and I was almost calling it a day, but yeah, it wasn't looking that nice. Mostly because the swirl wasn't being done properly. So I realized that I was gonna need another 3D object, in this case a plane with a hole, so I could map a texture right here, and so we could see the swirls passing in front of the orb. So this is what I got at this point. It was looking a little bit better. The center was essentially a sphere with Fresnel effect, and then I kinda created this sun, which somehow it's deviating a little bit from the original effect, but I stuck with it for a while longer. But essentially I was feeling like the purple one needed to be worked on a little bit better. So that's what I did, and I had these 2 orbs pretty much done, in a good stage to move on to the next stuff. Or at least I thought I was gonna move on to the next stuff, but yeah, I wasn't very happy the next day, Monday. So yeah, I went back to Blender and I exported the UV so I could properly create a texture. I essentially ended up using my drawing table and created this texture so I could have a bright ring. Yeah, it was looking a little bit better. Once I tested in Unity, I had mixed feelings about it, but I was already spending too much time around this texture. I eventually arrived at a point where I was like, yeah, okay, this is fine, this will do just alright. So I moved on to the next effect, which was not the electricity, not the arrow from Sasuke, but the explosion. Because the arrow from Sasuke would require a lot of electricity, and I wasn't ready for that. But then I eventually realized the explosion would also require electricity, so I had no way around it, and I began drawing some electric elements with this very bright blue. It was looking alright, I was happy with this, so I kept on working on that explosion, and at some point I had this growing red beam in the center. There's a few elements if you look to the explosion. There is this red flare in the center, a lot of wind swirls going on, and you begin seeing this electricity charging up the orb, and eventually there is this very bright orange at the center, and it really expands a lot. And there's a shockwave as well, yeah. I obviously reused a few of the elements that I already had for the orbs. I essentially kept on drawing electricity, a lot of electricity. Cool thing about electricity is that you can do it pretty quickly. Once you have the baseline, like this for example, you can then erase a little bit from here and there to create cavities, and then add a glow. Once you add it to Unity and add very bright blue, it really looks awesome. And I kept on drawing electricity and more electricity elements until I arrived at this point right here, which I was like, yeah, this is starting to look very, very interesting. But I eventually realized that the timings weren't that right, because timings are essential when it comes to visual effects. So I had to tweak a little bit this and then move on to the center, the very bright core of this explosion. I was only missing the expansion of the center, and that's what I did, that's what I got. So I moved on to the Sasuke. And I immediately noticed that in this shot right here I needed a 3D object, in this case an arrow and the bow, to shoot the arrow. So I fired up Blender, I modeled a very quick arrow, and I eventually got this arrow and bow. And once I imported them to Unity, I added the Fresnel effect. I tried to match the color of the electricity, even though I hadn't drawn the electricity for this. That was essentially the scariest part for me, because there was a lot of electricity going on in the shots. So I had to kind of improvise a little bit, especially considering that I only had a day and a half, not more than 2 days. So essentially I began drawing the electricity that was at the front of the arrow, so I could slap this electricity into the arrow, and at least I would have that part done. So I kept on drawing electricity for like an eternity, but once I had all of those elements ready to film, essentially, I was beginning to worry about the shots. Indeed, I really wanted to get those framings right, so I installed the timeline, I installed Cinemachine, I created a new timeline, and this was the first shot that I was working in, where essentially Naruto is charging the yellow orb. And I was like, yeah, okay, this is something, right? Let's make another shot, let's make shot 2, where we have the 2 orbs, one in each end, and there is a zoom out, a very quick zoom out, and it's blurred at the beginning. I had these 2 shots, and if you look closely to the original footage, there is this focus and focus moment, and it's shaking a lot, and that's what I was trying to recreate here. Yeah, I was super happy with this result. I then created this third shot, where we essentially see the camera going through the orbs. Yeah, this third shot required a bit more work, because there was movement from the camera to the sides, and the orbs would essentially create this kind of curvy path. They go to the bottom of the camera and then they go to the center. So I essentially created an empty for the 2 orbs and animated that empty. And at this point, for some reason, I stopped recording my progress. The only last footage I have of the progress that I was making is the arrow of Sasuke trying to get the shot of that arrow. But essentially, it was a lot of work to get the shots done with the same timings and to get the motion right. But this is the end result.
Let's do this!